can see me and hear me fine. So yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Olja. I'm from Zagreb, and this workshop is going to basically, hopefully, give you some insight in how to approach judging once you start doing it. I've been judging like thoroughly for like a year. I think some of my credentials include chairing the open semifinal of Oxford IB, of Yale IB, judging on final panels of those tournaments. I have over 30 judge breaks now, and I think I have probably some insight into what I'm talking about. I think it's very difficult to start judging or know how to approach it in the easiest way or the best way because it's complicated. So how this is gonna go? I do have like probably a 40 minutes worth of content, basically introductory content to judging by the WUDC judge manual, but I've tried to sort of try to make it more a bit more simple and like probably give you advice on what to do in like time continuum of around, if that makes sense. So like what you're going to do, like when you see the motion as a judge, how you're going to approach the round and analysis during the round, and then later the deliberation and the OA. So that was sort of the way that I structured it. I do have a PowerPoint to share. So if you do have any questions at any point, please just unmute yourself and ask them. Okay, I'm just trying to figure out how this works. Oh, sorry. Cool. Okay. Can someone just please audibly confirm that you can see this?
We can see that.
All right. Cool. Great. Then we can start. Yeah, so basically, as I said, the first thing that we're going to cover is how to approach a round, right? So firstly, what are all the small things we have to keep in mind before even the round starts, if we are adjudicating a round, if it's like even your first tournament judging. And yeah, so basically, I think there's also some prep they have to take into account as an adjudicator, right? So I think that obviously after the motion is released, it's very important that if there are some words that you're unfamiliar with, or just some concepts that probably seem a bit confusing to you, obviously just look up what the words mean, check the CA questions the same way that you would if you were prepping for a round and you didn't know like just what something meant or what was happening. The second thing that I put in, which I think obviously is probably a personal preference of judges, I think that it sort of helps out, especially once we start judging and are quite new to it, that I think it's useful to sort of think about the motion a bit in terms of like just what the possible clashes are or like intuitive arguments from both sides. Because I think it sort of builds this image in your mind of what is probably going to happen or what are the baselines of argumentation going to be like. Someone's going to say, hey, don't necessarily always do this, because it's like you might find yourself filling in the logical gap for teams once the round starts. But I think obviously, to the extent to which you're just thinking about the round and knowing what to expect, personally, I find that it makes it easier, right? Especially if it's like a room with like speakers that are like high quality, speak fast, have a lot of content. It's difficult to sort of track things down and mentally also track them and figure out where the argument is going or where the entire case is going at the point where you're just like, you know, sort of hearing these arguments for the first time at like 9 a.m. in the morning. So that's also something that I would definitely recommend in terms of approaching the round once you see the motion. Then I think obviously preparing notes. Everyone has their personal preference. You can either do it on paper or in more of a digital form. I would just say that for papers, obviously, intuitively, like papers that are a bit big enough, but probably don't have too many because you're going to lose yourself in them. Do it in a way that it's like easy to follow engagement. So I see a lot of people that do paper notes, just make it very simple. Like one sheet of paper is just like split in the middle. On the one side, you have like PM and then LO. And then on the different side of the paper, you're going to have DPM, DLO. So that it's like easy to track some sort of engagement. Obviously, you can also use in different colors. to track different things if it makes it easier for you. And the digital form, I personally use Word, but you can also use the Excel sheets. I've seen people do it, Open Office as well. I think it's just easy. You create a table that's like 2 times 2, and you just have distinction between teams like OG, OOC, GCO. Again, you can use different colors, so whatever is easiest for you, basically. Right. So then once, let's say, we're sort of in a round, we've sort of internalized the motion, and now the round starts, and people are gonna give arguments. I think it's important to know how to assess content critically as an adjudicator. So I think here I've covered a few metrics of how we adjudicate content. Again, also by the WUDC manual, which is persuasiveness or persuasion, rebuttal, burdens, and contradictions, which I think are all the crucial things that you have to take into account when you're adjudicating someone's case, someone's speech, whatever. So I start with probably the most relevant one, which is persuasiveness. So what does this mean, right? It's always when someone tells you analysis, right? But it's basically all the like reasons, examples, intuition prompts on why the assumption of the argument is just likely to be true, right? So obviously, if you have one argument which just sort of asserts like, if we do X, that's going to bring to safety, and then a claim which says that is an assumption, like if we do X is going to bring to safety, and then here are 3 reasons as to why different stakeholders are going to react in a way which brings safety. If those 3 reasons were there and they're like logically sound, in terms of they just sound like correct sentences and they're not contradicting itself, etc., there would probably be a well-analyzed argument in terms of just giving you more reasons why a logical conclusion is likely to be the one from the assumption of the argument, right? I think that sort of sounds like sort of intuitive in terms of how do we weigh up when something is an assertion and when someone just probably gives more reasons as to why something true. Maybe also I find it easier because I think this is all like quite vague, and probably when we also started speaking, it was quite difficult for us to imagine, you know, what made a difference between like an asserted argument, like a very well made argument. But I also think there's now this sort of trend in debating where I think we're going to hear a lot of speakers do it in a way which is probably sort of more mechanic, like, or like, you know, technical, but I think it helps judges a lot, which is like, this is my assumption, I have 3 reasons why, and then actually just list off 3 reasons, or this is not true, here are 5 reasons as to why this is not true, and then they actually say like 5 things. Obviously, there's a difference between someone just saying sentences, right? So it's not the same to say, I have 3 reasons why, and those 3 reasons just being like, again, asserted sentences. But that there's some sort of cohesion and logic behind all of these, which very often is sort of has more strength with like an intuition pump, with like a good example between sort of, you know, behind every one of these statements, etc. So I think that's probably sort of some more of a nuance different here in terms of like analysis. I also just wanted to mention here that, you know, also the what I just used was sort of like a practical quote unquote example, but I think principles should be evaluated by the same metric. So whenever you have an assumption in a principle, a good principle argument always has like a few of those like steps that you have to fill. It just sort of every assumption of the principle probably has to be proven in the same way, which is like, this is the assumption of this part of the argument, and then why it's true. Now, this sounds like quite simple, but what I think is very, very important to cover, especially when we sort of start judging, is all the things that don't matter and all the things we shouldn't take into account, because sometimes that's easier than what we do. So firstly, like the number of arguments that a speaker makes, I think if just the assumptions were asserted, so someone says, I have 5 arguments in this prime minister's speech, and they have like 5 sentences which sound cool, but they sort of keep repeating and they don't go beyond just asserting something will happen without any like sort of incentive analysis, characterization that makes it likely to be true, etc. Then it just doesn't matter if they have like 5 of those that are like plausible-ish, and then let's say Op had like 3 arguments that were like well made, right? So the number probably doesn't matter. Secondly, like how innovative or interesting the argument was. Obviously, if someone just does like a cool argument and we think it's fun, good. If someone asks you for feedback, you can say that was a good idea, we should probably keep working on it. But in case if it just was not a well-proven argument, it's just sort of like a wild assertion or like a wild principle of some sorts, it can be very fun. You could probably tell them also how to improve it or whatever, but we can't give someone who higher speaks if it's just like, I would never heard this, like it wasn't proven, like you tried, but it was fun. Like those are not things that we should take into account. And then thirdly, which is important, it's like arguments that you're aware of but which weren't made, right? So obviously we would sometimes personally run something differently, or we sometimes tend to think that, oh, the things that I would run, did not happen, or I would do it better, or whatever. It's very important to take a step back and just evaluate around and by what happened, and also once you're going like to the speaker scale, etc. To try to be more realistic, because like obviously sometimes going to be emotions in which we know like a ton of stuff about, and then if you go to the metrics, then you're just gonna be like, in the speaker scale, like, oh, could this be beaten by like a persuasive response or whatever? I just think a lot of things in judging, I think, is going to be in the next slide as well. What is really important is to sort of have a self-correcting mechanism for a lot of these things. It's not just like, here's a magical tip how to be a good judge. I think there are a lot of biases that all of us have. It is also a psychological game at some point, which we're going to get to later. Like, it's just very important to be extremely self-aware, and you're going to avoid a lot of issues or a lot of mistakes that could happen in terms of any sort of bias that you have, if you have a specific preference for a speaker, for a type of argument, for whatever, which we're going to cover in the next slide. Genuinely, just sort of keep yourself in check, and I think you're going to be fine. So what I wanted to also mention is all the other factors that like might impact how we perceive the persuasiveness of claims. So going beyond just like a well-analyzed argument and what it means from the beginning, right? Firstly, like fancy complex words. I think a lot of us probably know that like obviously someone can use complex, fancy PL language. It just doesn't mean that the claim is just likely to be true or more likely, or that the argument is made in any sort of better way than an ESL speaker would. Also, probably if I don't know, if someone's using like very, very fancy complex English very fast, like to me it impacts possibility sometimes even negatively, because I'm like, look, there are certain things that I can track, certain things I cannot, but in any way it shouldn't impact the persuasiveness of claims overall. And sort of always trying to keep ourselves in check of like the EPL extensions and things. Secondly, accents. Again, just because someone is ESL or EFL and we might all have specific accents, yeah, use language that isn't complex. Just use normal, reasonable words. That also shouldn't impact the possibility of someone's claims or speaker points. Thankfully, sort of style doesn't really play a big role in adjudicating in VP. And then thirdly, emotions. Like, I think this is sort of where it gets tricky, right? Because there are going to be speeches that could just be like beautiful enough itself, but they could be quite rhetorically strong. But obviously, there is a nuance, like if the content that delivered, so like won the debate or was persuasive or not. What I do find nice, and also I think the manual does say this explicitly, which is like emotions or like a rhetorically beautiful speech could be like rewarded with like higher speaks. To the extent to which this is sort of still like a public speaking thing, and if they're just going to be speeches that are like good but very like sort of monotone, if you know what I mean, just like not really emotions or like any sort of changes in voice, it's just like listing off things for like 7 minutes, and that same speech but like that just has some sort of emotion to it, that's have like more rhetorical intuition pumps or you know, things like that, is something that should be just sort of evaluated probably in a vacuum in terms of speaks. But then again, it shouldn't persuade, like, you know, that doesn't mean that speakers should win, just that I think it's fair to reward these types of speeches slightly more, and the manual agrees with this one. Fourthly, again, personal experiences, like someone might make an argument that we might not think is necessarily true, or you know, we would sort of run it differently, or whatever. We know these people, whatever. So the personal experiences when it comes to knowing certain speakers, knowing certain judges, knowing certain arguments, always just sort of check yourself. Like, I think that's the easiest thing to do, right? Objectively, just like forget about the name, forget about whatever, or sometimes even if we sort of get annoyed by some argument that someone makes, like whatever, it's just like, now I'm gonna take a step back, look at my notes, and evaluate the notes, and that's it. And I think that also important just works for like rep. I think that it's completely fair to be like, look, it is very much possible for some excellent and famous speakers to just not deliver in certain rounds, and that's completely fine. It's gonna happen, and like, I think what's going to happen if you're like sort of a new judge that doesn't have like a lot of rep and you're trying to get your break, very often it's going to seem like the most intuitive, the most correct call is that like this person just like got an 83 and like they proved it. But I think it just won't be true always. And I think assessing these types of speeches critically, or even more critically sometimes in terms of like when you're going through your notes, and just double check yourself, because like, oh, let's say you know who this person is, like you look up to them or whatever, to just try to be very, very realistic. And I think also, well, I mentioned that in the libs slightly later, but like, even if you look at it more critically or talk about it longer on a panel because you're not even sure, like you're like, it might be my bias, but I'm not sure if, let's say, I buy this type of rebuttal, etc. I think it's probably more important and probably more persuasive to your panel, and good to think in that way than to be like, yeah, they did it. Oh my God, they did it. They got an 83. Let's move along. So these sorts of things. I just wanted to cover all of this because I think it's very important to keep in mind, especially when I don't know, we start judging, there are like a lot of internal biases. So just sort of, I don't know, remind ourselves not to fall for these traps. Cool. Rebuttal or engagement, I think this is basically the same metric of persuasion that it was for positive claims. In terms of, look, it's not just enough to say, well, this just won't happen, or like, this is absurd, or they just asserted one thing, so I considered another, right? Or if you, I don't know, if you just have like what we said, like a lot of reasons why an argument is likely to be true, and then someone just like takes down one out of those three good reasons why a claim is true, is not enough to sort of completely defeat the claim, slightly mitigate the likelihood of that analysis, but not a complete takedown of the argument. So in a way, what I would say, how do we credit rebuttal, or how can we say the rebuttal was strong enough or good enough to beat another claim, is because I think if plausible reasons are just provided against the claim, right? So if you have a positive argument, which is like, hey, here's why this would happen, 5 reasons, I think rebuttal should probably work in the same way, right? So op has this assumption, here are the reasons why this is a wrong assumption or why this won't work. Very often, you're going to also have like persuasive trade-offs, in terms of, look, here are the reasons why this won't happen, or just making like a negative persuasive, like positive claim, a substantive claim. But even if it does, here are the reasons why it's like also still like less important than X. No, again, note that just because someone says, like, even if we're taking them at their best and the highest ground, doesn't necessarily mean that they did that, like, realistically. But that trade-offs probably also like are substantive material in terms of rebuttal. So it's because it's to have engagement or to weigh content is not enough to say, look, this is the argument, here is why the argument is wrong, but also, you know, assess the likelihood. So like, even if the argument is true in 5% of the cases, here is why this is more important than like an intuition pump or a reason. Or even if they're correct in most of the cases, here's why this what we have is more relevant, etc. So these are also things that should be taken into account when we're looking at, was the engagement and rebuttal done well? In terms of extensions, so basically this is a question like, is rebuttal a valid extension if done well? And obviously it is. Like, rebuttal, flipping, or the argument, or the weighing trade-offs that I talk about are all valid extensions and should be credited as such. So I gave just an example here, right? Even if OG has good responses to OO. If member of government or government whip gave better responses that are like stronger or like have more persuasive reasons, they should be weighed as like solid contributions in terms of engagement, or in this case, like bigger or better engagement with opening up. But what I meant to say was like, it is a valid extension that should be taken into account when weighing the gov bench in this instance, based on, you know, obviously the substantive material. Then we're going to go to extensions in a second, but in terms of like rebuttal and engagement, yes, it definitely is an extension. And in whips, you know, was it a whip extension? Was it not? I think that if the new material is explicitly weaponized as rebuttal, in terms of like op whip says, look, Olja's assumption is this, here are reasons why this isn't true. I think even if those reasons why, I don't know, OG's argument were not in a member of opposition speech, I still think it's a valid contribution. It is like sort of a, you know, they have to say that it is like, or you can see that definitely was weaponized as explicit rebuttal, not making like a new argument or like a new extension. But if it's flagged as rebuttal and it serves the purpose of a rebuttal, it is rebuttal in this instance. And I think these are sort of all the cases in which we ought to rebuttal. What I think then is obviously important is burdens. I think that obviously motion types have some sort of formula to them, you know, and what we expect teams to provide or engage with within that formula. So it is sort of like the basic stuff, the basic thing, and like, hey, this is a type of motion, this is what we expect of you to do. I do think it's good to remind yourself of how that works. So we have this house would. It's always good to remind yourself that there is some sort of a fiat with a model or counter model. Secondly, this house regrets. We expect teams to, on gov, analyze the counterfactual, engage with it, or sorry, make like a comparative case with it, counterfactual, on oppositions to engage with the counterfactual to the same extent. If governments don't fail to provide it, then the burden is on oppositions to do so. At some point, this house as X, which I think it is very, very important in judging, or like it happens that people just very often just sort of realize that it's not an actor motions, and that is like the motion which has the most specific formula in terms of adjudicating or in terms of debating, and it's the most simplest one, right? Which is this house as X, what are all the interests and incentives of my actor X, and then how they sort of weigh up. And all of my arguments sort of lead to proving that something is in the interest of this actor. But very often it happens that just, you know, teams just don't sort of realize that, or sort of run like arguments that are probably like true generally, but we are not sure why an actor cares about them. So I think that probably is the formula that is most often not, you know, not engaged with, and I think is important, obviously. Fourthly, we have, you know, this house believes that we should prioritize X over Y. So again, some sort of a burden on, it's not enough to, let's say, for government to only prove why X is better than Y, but also like vice versa, right? So what I wanted to say is like not only good or bad arguments for X, but also Y. That I think there is also a double burden that every side has at any point, which I think is covers all of these things. I think there is in most instances on prop, a burden to prove, let's say, you know, whatever, you would implement something. This house would implement policy X, doesn't matter. I think that there is a burden which says on prop, you have to prove why implementing a policy X is good, beneficial, whatever. But I also think there is a other burden that propositions have in this instance is to sort of engage with the status quo, or to prove why some sort of alternatives don't work, or whatever opposition is bringing in doesn't work. And I think it works for oppositions in the same way. So you have to prove why the implementing policy X would be bad, but also there's a burden on you to prove why status quo is good, and why there is a trend for things to sort of keep getting better. These sound like very basic and be like, yes, or that these are the two basic burdens that every side gets. I think it's just very useful to remember those when adjudicating, or when sort of, if someone, you know, what is missing in a certain case, or what makes one case overall stronger than the other in terms of burdens that teams have. I think that those basics ones, and very often just don't end up being filled in the same way. And I think those two very simple burdens just make the other, stronger. Like I think the op case is a much stronger one, which says, hey, here are all the other alternatives, but also good persuasive alternatives, reasons why alternatives are good, and then also reasons why this policy won't work, than just an opposition case, which is, here's why this won't work. That might also be a good op case. I just think it's much stronger, fulfills also the other implicit burden that you have as an opposition team. So I wanted to flag that when we were getting to this point. This house believes that we should do X, usually this house believes that at the point where there is no model fiat, there is a burden to prove why X would be done, or like the policy example would be implemented in a specific way. We can just assert this is what would happen. There have to be reasons why someone would implement a policy in a certain way, or the impacts of the policy would play out for whatever incentive analysis or reasons teams give, but that doesn't have the model. And then this house believes that X was good for Y, or this house believes that it was illegitimate. So why did I find these two, or why did I combine them? When a metric is provided for teams in the wording, obviously I think the argument should be made and evaluated based on these metrics, right? But also the definition of what is good and what is legitimate, and then evaluating the arguments in that sort of sense. So if motion was, this house believes that Putin was good for Russia, I think what people should do is probably look at the word good and then be like, okay, so what are all of the metrics and how we measure an actor like a president / prime minister, whatever, being good for a country, and then running all of the arguments both on prop, on op, engaging with the metrics of good. In this instance, this house believes that the state is illegitimate, defining what legitimate or illegitimate means, and then running the arguments, sort of reaching sort of that base criteria or the base definition of what we find the concept of legitimate to be. So these are all the things that I wanted to mention in terms of implicit burdens that teams have, either by being just a prop or op, but also in all of the specific motion types. Contradictions and how do we value them? I think first, if you're looking like the same team or same speech and there is a contradiction, I think both implicit and explicit tensions impact the persuasiveness of a case, right? So even if someone doesn't point out a tension in someone's case, but you do see it, or you do notice it yourself in your notes and it was quite there, just no one said it, I still think it sort of impacts the persuasiveness of a certain case or a claim. And just the basic formula is we're going to credit the argument or rebuttal or whatever piece of content that came before the contradiction, and just sort of not look at the clearly contradicting content, whether if it's in the same speech or from the same team. We auto-credit the one that came out first, purely because that's the claim that most teams expected to engage with. So yeah, there was a knife thing, because this is always really, really fun. If a closing team contradicts their opening. So look, what is a knife is, I think, explicitly going against the assumption or the goal of your opening, which is to say, X will lead to safety, and then CG is like, X will just not lead to safety, right? What I think isn't a knife, and this is, I think, an important nuance, is if OG says, look, X will lead to safety, but CG is smart enough to say, although X will lead to safety, there are many other reasons why safety would occur, so an example, or why this argument is not as relevant. And I think there was like also that discussion, which you can see on Debating CIS posting a few weeks ago, which was like, is this a new trend in debating where closings are rebutting their opening? I'm not sure if necessarily like a new trend. I think people have just gotten probably more courageous with the words that they're using. But I think it's not a knife, right? I think obviously we expect from closing teams to weigh themselves with their opening. And very often you can just be like, oh yeah, OG made an 81, good enough of an argument, and mine is also an 81 good enough of an argument, so I'm going to come up with a niche metric that somehow makes mine better. Like, obviously you have to sort of quote unquote rebut your opening in terms of not contradicting them and still presuming that their claim is true. So in the example I provided, let's say this specific policy is definitely going to lead to safety for, let's say for this whatever group. But look, there are many other trends in status quo, there are many other things that also sort of help these groups. So although OG is correct, the impact of that claim in whatever framing that I just came up with as this whip probably makes it less relevant or less exclusive or whatever. So in that case, I don't think that people should just jump and be like, you rebutted your opening. I think it was probably an attempt at weighing. Was it good or not is up to you, obviously, in terms of what those reasons were. Were they persuasive claims? Were there reasons? But in and of itself, that specifically is not knifing. What I think is then also very important is, look, if opening runs a team line, then and this is difficult because there is no like a specific formula for this, but when I say that something is not in spirit of emotion or just a definition that is just completely not implied, there was always like this Cooley example that we were taught, which is like this house would ban the selling of organs or whatever, and then if you just have an OG that thinks that organs as an instrument as opposed to like bodily organs, then like so obviously this is the most intuitive example that I could come up with now, but you know what I mean, right? I think it's completely fair to say that closing doesn't have a burden to follow that team line, and I think can debate under a framing that's probably just more likely, or the one that opposition challenges, because I think very often in these instances it's not going to be like OG's like, oh yeah, it's about the instruments, and it's going to be like, oh yeah, definitely, bro, we're talking about instruments and not like bodily parts, so I think it's completely fair for then CG to be like, yes, if always reasonable is like, no, we're talking about selling your kidney, that CG is like, yes, let's talk about that. And I think very often in actual rounds, it's not this example, the closings are going to try to get out of it by sort of being like, I'm engaging with op, or I'm engaging with the other side on their best ground, and I think that's completely also fine. But also, if there is an instance in which closing is taking a slightly different approach to a round or a framing, I think they do have a burden to prove, if it's not something that sort of their opening relied on, or sort of a specific round, they have to prove it, but it's just like more likely for their new world or for the new framing to be a more reasonable one. So that they still have a burden to indicate, why their opening steam line was actively harmful to their side, a lot of businesses. And the reason why I think that sort of exists is because it's also easy, right? So in the example of like organs, I think you could just be like, for like closing, like, I just don't think that there is a problem with the black market selling of organs, but people do kill each other. So I think that this is like a reasonable assumption in this round. But it's still, there's a burden for closing to at least slightly indicate why their opening was slightly out in terms of definitions. So not a contradiction, but then again, have to prove why not. Cool. And now we've gone through all the things that your mind can possibly assess while judging an hour of a round. Cool. How do we then evaluate all the content and reach an initial call within ourselves in those few minutes when someone tells you, let's take a few minutes and go over our notes? But these are all the things that you should probably keep in mind as the round is happening. And these are all the questions and small mechanisms that your mind sort of learns to do as soon as it's hearing a round, in the same way that we're participating in a round and then coming up with rebuttal as we go along. It's the same way with weighing. So how would we then evaluate sort of top half weighing clashes, both teams engage with? Look, I think the easiest way to do it is to sort of by clashes and genuinely how the arguments clash in terms of like what metrics, what was the thing that was mostly talked about, etc. A few things that you should probably ask yourselves is, obviously, one, once they pinpoint a clash, how strong were the arguments, how strong were the claims on both sides within this clash? Secondly, then were the rebuttals strong from like both teams in terms of, was it like only mitigation, so it sort of slightly mitigates the likelihood of this claim, or was it like completely flipping it, making it into their own positive claim? Was there good even ifs, etc.? And then thirdly, what type of weighing was done made by the speakers on certain metrics, whatever those are that people choose? Was this argument exclusive enough? Was the likelihood of this claim? Are we covering the most important stakeholder? Are we covering the biggest stakeholder, the large, whatever, all the basic metrics of why something could be better than anything else. I think all of these three things probably you overlook them quite holistically, right? When you see, let's say there's a clash on safety, Gov says this, Op says this, then you look at sort of like if they're equally well proven arguments, okay, then you're probably looking at rebuttal and who had more stronger responses, who's taking a higher burden, maybe with an even if for proving that their content was more important, etc. So all of these things, I would say holistically. What is then important to take into account are two things. One, if teams don't have explicit weighings or prioritization at all, so you're just sort of stuck in this deadlock of like two, like, you know, the top half is just genuinely just like, you know, people make claims and they say other claims are not true, but very little lack of engagement and, you know, equally well done arguments. I think you should then prioritize the clashes that teams made implicitly more relevant, right? Those are probably the clashes that like carry weight in terms of a lot of time was spent on them. They cover like impact the most specific actors that are like important. Obviously, I think we can sometimes pinpoint what the most important thing was. Very often the ones that people spend most time on were like that teams focused on and implicitly gave it relevance. And then obviously then you can sort of weigh who won that clash, even for like a slight, you know, inch, but then that clash should be prioritized over something else that was just like sort of mentioned and didn't really end up being relevant. And then secondly, that look, if I think arguments that were genuinely just like asserted shouldn't be taken into account. I think unless there's like that very, very odd thing that just tends to happen, but it's rare if like all the other clashes are just sort of a wash or just like equally asserted. This can happen like, you know, novice rooms or like bad rooms that are competitions like round 5 and no one, or like round 4, no one can just really, everyone's dead. So at some point you're just like, people are just saying things, but like it doesn't make a lot of sense. Or just like equally as probable or improbable, then I think sometimes, you know, the number of things that were said or asserted arguments could sort of flip it if it's like a very, very tight clash, because they can make a difference in how plausible their case was. What were these claims even rebutted? So maybe they were left standing. The reason why I'm just sort of mentioning this is because I think sort of always pretend that you're going to be judging like such a nice, lovely room where it's going to be so easy to make these things is probably false. Like, and there are going to be a lot of rooms which you're going to ask yourself, how am I supposed to do it? Like, or, you know, I think very often the more lower rooms, or like when you're judging like novices, those are the ones that are going to be quite difficult to judge, as opposed to you judging 81 speakers. They're going to do all this work for you, right? You're just going to have to, your job is going to be to recognize what they did, when you're going to have then, you know, 74s. You're not going to get any of this, and then you have to do all of this by yourself as a judge. So I just want to be like completely transparent with you that there are going to be times where it's going to be very difficult and the teams won't make sense necessarily, and then you're going to have to make sense for them. And this is why I sort of had all of these very oddly specific scenarios which could happen, to just sort of be like, well, you're sometimes going to have to justify your call based on these things. It happens, and I just wanted for everyone not to ignore it. It's going to be difficult. All right, extensions. How to create extensions? There are obviously a few types. Vertical extensions. It's fine if there's the same assumption of the argument on the bench. The question is, did the teams fill the crucial logical gaps in their openings analysis? So if opening does a nice argument, and you know what, CG adds like 2 or 3 cool lines of analysis, unless it's like weighed well, in and of itself, it's not an extension, right? But I think if the way in which OG's argument was made and it was like vulnerable to O's responses, but CG added those lines that actually made it less vulnerable, or like responded to opposition's rebuttal better, although if this was the same argument, I think that means filling the crucial logical gap in someone's analysis in terms of extensions. Again, just wanted to mention here, I don't know, I guess I was really angry at EPL people. Examples of EPL extensions don't count. We had to mention it twice. And then secondly, stronger responses that we talked about before, I think are a valid extension. Or if you responded to a rebuttal that was strong enough, let's say on top half, and impacted your opening's case, but you made it less likely that it's going to impact yours. Amazing, strong responses, definitely valid extensions. Obviously, new arguments. And if they're just proven in a plausible, like a relevant way, they should be taken into account. And I think this is obviously like very important, and I think you're going to hear a lot of judges sort of say when there's like a very, very close call on like a bench, is that if the amount of persuasion or persuasiveness of both teams is like broadly similar, we do expect members or whips to like make a clear distinction with their opening. So if there is no proper weighing, you out to place opening over closing in those instances, right? They're just going to happen, and like a lot of times this is just true. Opening has 3 well-done arguments, CG has 3 well-done arguments, and then CG whip doesn't mention OG at all. I am not sure whose case was better. Like if they're just well-done argument, they engage with like oppositions well enough, it's like a gov bench. I'm sorry, but in that case, it probably is OG over CG based on just like the burdens that closing teams have. And I think also this is like very important. What I mean by weighing is not saying OG had this argument and my member had this argument and that means we win. Obviously, the way the weighing or good weighing is done, if whip, and I think we talked about this before when it was like knifing, but I think that's probably how good weighing is done. It's like, look, this is OG's argument, but whatever. It was vulnerable to O's response here. Or they, the argument is just not as exclusive. The impact accrues in a lot of different ways. Or they kind of just be like, hey, they didn't prove this well enough, but my speaker sort of filled in all of these gaps that make this assumption more likely to be true in this instance. It's just like being specific and genuinely just like assessing their openings content and not just observing the openings content, be like, but my member said this, because then we're not sure why whatever the member said was more important. So I think that's how you sort of make yourself evaluate weighing in a proper way also, to be just like, okay, when someone is, as soon as you hear from my closing and now to my opening, good, write everything that these people say and then just be like, okay, was this weighing or was it sort of observing what your opening did? And were reasons provided why your case was better and not just asserted? That's how you can pinpoint just a fine weighing as opposed to no weighing. Yes, and then again, 2 niche instances that could happen because debating is fun. One is like if you're going to have, so when you evaluate like a closing team versus a closing team, when there is like a significant lack of responsiveness to each other, that what happens when it's just like someone has a niche extension, someone has a niche extension that just sort of whips, ignore each other and focus on the top half. We prioritize a team with a more persuasive new material compared to top half, right? So let's say it's like a clear top half and then sort of both closing teams are sort of struggling for an extension and not really engaging with each other because they're pretending to be different than their opening. You'd be surprised. Like I think it happens. Then when you probably have to look at them in a vacuum, right? If they didn't engage with each other explicitly, who had genuinely just like more new material in the member speech, like who did something that made me feel like that was more of an extension or more new examples, more new intuition pumps. That is probably a team you should auto prioritize in this very niche specific situation that unfortunately happens a lot. And then secondly, when you evaluating closing versus closing, significant lack of extension, then you're probably going to look at the team that sort of had more persuasive engagement with the other bench. I think both of these work in the same way, right? If both closings are just not really responsive, it was like a shallow, whatever, they just didn't have anything, and they with quite clearly a top half, you're going to find something to evaluate it. Basically, this wanted to flag. It's either going to be some new content member, might be some new rebuttal or whip, just find something new and then credit that in these sort of very sad instances. And quickly, diagonals. I think it's like the same thing when you're looking at the slide 8, which is like, how do we judge top half and basic clashes? And what are all the questions that we have to ask ourselves for judging a basic clash? Is the same way with diagonal, right? Because it's just like 2 teams, there's content interacting with each other. But obviously, the diagonals, the most important thing here is to then look at also POIs to evaluate like the quality of POI, whether it was like given as a rebuttal or weighing or like gave a certain response. Again, also there was a discussion on the serious posting about this. How do we evaluate the POIs if like the closing, let's say, didn't take POIs from their opening? I think there are 2 cases. The first one being, look, I think if the diagonal like is just like extremely, extremely close, and you can presume, like, what I meant by this, because it sounds like presume a reasonable POI. So if you can imagine a POI just like basically following the government's case, and you can intuitively imagine probably what their response would be to, like, say, like a CO case, or just you think that it would only take one good rebuttal that could fit into 15 seconds to take down someone's case, or like to cast enough doubt on someone's claim that you can be like, yeah, no, it is OG over CO. In that case, it should be taken into account that a POI was not offered. And I think this does happen, and it often diagonals just are quite close, and if people don't really realize that, at the point when OG just does a lot of things, and sometimes people forget about OG, but like they just didn't have like a lot of material, and CO can have like a really, really cool extension, and then some rebuttals to OG. Like in those instances, and most of them, I think they're going to be things when it's like you're just like quite close, but there's a lack of weighing, sometimes lack of engagement, or OG didn't prove this enough. In that instance, if OG was really trying to engage like with both speakers with the extension, and just they were not given the opportunity to do so, I think that should be penalized for closing. And then B, or the other situation is like, I think what is then fair, you know, and that is good to be very clear. Like if just closing was significantly more nuanced and persuasive in terms of you have a closing that was 82 and their opening was at 74, and like one of the speakers or both of them didn't necessarily take a POI, you can take down, you know, that in their speaks if it's something that you want to do, which probably should be done. We need to find some sort of way to stop this from happening, but like at that point, I don't think a POI would have necessarily taken down that case. Like if someone's just like clearly winning because they have like 5 extensions, someone had like 2 assertions, you can't be like, oh, you didn't take a POI from OO, therefore you take a second, right? I just think it is on judges in this instance, or panels, obviously, to be like, okay, so do you think that a POI would have been enough to resolve this clash for us if it's like very close? And then based on that answer, I think is how you know if the POI, not taking a POI should be taken into account when adjudicating diagonals. Yeah, and I think I covered these like 2 things, which is like, okay, so now you've reached your initial call, you have something, you have assessed everything, all of the diagonals, all the things. How to approach the deliberation if you're like a wing or trainee for starters, and I also then quickly have on chairs. So I think explanations is what do you call it, precise and concise. What I wanted to say about this is that like I don't think it should take you longer than 2 minutes, but I also think 2 minutes is sometimes okay. Let's say it shouldn't take you longer than 2 minutes to analyze relation, or to analyze like a specific question, right? So why do you think OO takes over OG? Again, not to be like too vague, just be like, OO had better rebuttals, or OO had a stronger case, but also not to be like, okay, so Prime Minister says this, LO says this, DPM says this, like, no. I think that you should provide reasons why a team beats another team, like almost when you're making an argument in a round, right? Because I think deliberations very often just sort of are debates about a debate, specifically it's a close and they're going to be like splits, etc. What makes your contribution in a panel relevant, what makes your persuasion as a chair later, is that when you're looking at the content and you have to, like, you know, CG takes over OO, why? It's on you to provide all of the reasons. Like, remember when it's like, how do we make a persuasive argument? Here are the reasons why X claim is true. Basically, what are the reasons why CG takes over OO based on all of the arguments? And I think that's easy to pinpoint in terms of like, it could something be strategy, and could be like, I think I had like, if the chair asks you why does CG take over OO, I think you should go something like this. You're like, okay, I think there are like a few things. The first one, I think this claim from CG, or like this specific argument, sort of interacts with OO like in this way because their claim was this. Secondly, I just think that this BOI response, blah, 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 you know? To sort of be structured and like these simple reasons, obviously, also is on side of caution. Like if chair doesn't understand something I think is vague, they're just going to ask you, hey, could you elaborate on this? And that's completely fine. Whereas I really think it's problematic when, you do ask someone a question and they just really talk for like 4 minutes, and then it becomes quite awkward. I think people can be like assertive chairs, and that's completely fine. I sometimes am too, and then you have to be like, okay, but it is sort of awkward. And then I will remind people, like, take your time, you have your time, but we have to be done in like 15 to 20 minutes, and other people should probably talk too. So just keep that in mind and try to make yourself structured as possible so your contribution is valuable, but it doesn't take up too much time. Yes, and like, look, and this is very important. I think if you're not sure or think it's close, or your initial call, you're not completely set on it, that's completely fine. And it's very important to say that. You don't have to pretend to stand behind something to just sort of seem like smart, like seem like, oh yeah, I'm gonna break, because like you really don't have to. And it's just much easier for everyone, just like, you know what, I think this is close, or this specific thing confuses me, so this would be my call now, but maybe like I'm willing to be persuaded, otherwise I'm a bit confused. Completely fine. But what would then also be really, really cool is to like prepare questions for the rest of the panel, right? Not only, so this is not just, hey, I'm confused and these specific things are what the links that are missing for me to realize what happened, but even if you think it's like very, very close, and you're just like, this is who came first, this came fourth, like it's close between the second and the third, to have sort of to be like, okay, so this is what confuses me in this, let's say, top half clash. So if someone on the panel can prove to me that OO did manage to prove their argument on safety, I might be willing to flip to OO. So like one of these things. So to have these specific questions that would make you, let's say, flip, or would make the situation more clear for you, or just something that you don't understand. But have those sort of questions prepared, the ones that the lib starts, that you can let the rest of the panel know that they can interact with you, and vice versa. I think that's probably the most relevant thing when it comes to engagement on panels. I think obviously just important thing, like, don't interrupt other people or the chair, but it's important to be confident yet not cocky. Like, if you believe in your call, do stand behind it, right? So obviously not like, oh my God, my chair is like, oh, this is such an amazing judge, obviously I'm wrong. You know what, maybe you are wrong, and that's completely fine. But if you have some reasons that you want to share as to why you think you're correct, do so. Not to be like rude or anything, but it's completely fine. Like, okay, well, this is how I see it, these are the reasons why I would vote this way. And then again, you might be persuaded by them, but don't just automatically assume that you're completely in the wrong, or whatever they say, you're just gonna be like, yeah, that makes sense, I'm gonna flip. You don't have to. You can be completely honest with people. And very important, ask for feedback if you're like a trainee or a wing, or even as a chair, but specifically when you're starting, like, to sort of be like, what are the things that I should sort of improve on? Is very often like important to just text your chairs. Probably with specific questions though. I think just sort of being like, hey, we were on a panel, kind of get some feedback. Also nice if someone has something specific to say, they probably will, but also you can probably focus on things that you would personally like want to sort of fix. You can ask someone, hey, do you think that this explanation of this relation was good? Or like, do you think I was too vague? Or do you think more specific questions and feedbacks would probably get you further than just being like, hey, we paneled together in round 2. Do you have some feedback for me? Because, then you can just be like, yeah, it was fine. Unless someone asks a specific question, you're just like, oh, yeah, that. And then you can give someone a good answer. So also when asking for feedback, make sure that your questions are strong. And these are just like a few things when you're leading the discussion as a chair for the first time, or like you're starting to chair rounds. Everything goes in the same way that we just discussed. You just like write down initial calls, as everyone heard initial calls. And secondly, quickly just compare like individual calls. So when you look at everyone's, like, you can sort of see where the most contentious part of the call is, right? So if everyone agrees on like who's first and second, but people have different opinions on who's third and fourth, obviously the first thing you're going to do is talk about, hey, you think this team was third, can you tell me why? Okay, you think this team was fourth, tell me why. And then tell me why. Sorry, but like, you know, and then lastly, so this is what just happens and very often causes a shit show. If the initial calls are just like drastically different, like there are 3 panelists and nothing is sort of making sense. Like everyone has first to fourth, second, third mess. Don't overcomplicate it. Like I think at that point you're just like, okay, I am on the 20 minutes. Like the clock starts now to go through all of the things. So like you can do it however you want. It's going to be easier to interpret based on the round and what everyone's sort of initial calls were. But like obviously, okay, let's discuss top bench. Let's discuss extensions. Like so, you know, I like to do it chronologically. Like so, you discuss top half, then CG, then CO, and then like the diagonals if there were disagreements on those. But like just no any panic, but like just, you know, start chronologically and just like be more time sensitive, but like get it in is what I would basically say. It's not scary at all. And I think more important things that like for chairs, which I think becomes like relevant, is like, look, don't be afraid to cut people off in a respectful way if they're taking a lot of your time or just not really making a lot of sense, and they are taking a lot of your time. It's completely fine to be like, hey, sorry, okay, cool, I get it, but you know, we have to be time sensitive, etc. Secondly, I think that look, if you're really strongly convinced in your call and you haven't gotten like persuasive reasons to necessarily flip, but they're sort of like quite strong and they want to split or whatever, it's completely fine to ask them, look, what I just told you about like winging, what questions do you need answered to be convinced that X won over Y? And then you try to answer these questions. And I think asking someone that on a panel very openly, whether you're a wing or a chair, just makes it much easier, and not people trying to have like a psychological game of listening to you but not actually listening to you. Just like, okay, so what do you think this side had to prove, or like this team, for you to flip? Or like what's missing for you, then try to find that in your notes for them to be able to answer that question. And yeah, if it's in a relationship is taking too much time, don't be afraid to call about. We're probably there to sort of try to give teams something valuable of an OA or feedback. And if it takes 30 minutes, you're just hogging everyone and you're not going to reach a call, like a new different catharsis. It's not going to happen. Yeah, and I think what's also then, I mean, this probably happens like speaker points, always have the speaker scale ready, whatever the one the tournament proposed. Most often it is a standard speaker scale at this point. Secondly, I think that it's easiest, like you start with Adjudicator first, you go to like the categories, the most like basic ones from the 70s to the 80s or 85s, whatever. You can quickly sort of pinpoint a category. Once you do that a lot of times, you should sort of know the categories by heart. And then discuss with the panel, like, was there a specific speaker that you thought was better? You know, what specific thing do you want to credit more? How big the gap was between the two speakers, or if they were broadly the same? It's a very often speaks are sometimes a subjective thing, and that's why people sort of have to discuss them and be like, this is how I see it, this is how I see it. But you can never go wrong if you just simply go over the categories and compare notes and be like, okay, this is a 78, 79, cool. Again, and everything, like the entire process shouldn't take more than 20 minutes. For all of this to happen, we always have to be quite time sensitive. And I think this is the last thing, and then is always, once you're starting like oral adjudications, what I think is the best way, look, just find an approach that suits you, that makes the most sense in your mind. Very often it is chronological, like from first to fourth. Sorry, it's chronological in terms of like OGO, CGCO. Some people like to do it first to fourth. Some people do it fourth to first. There are a lot of things, just what makes you feel most confident that you'll be able to explain that well is basically the approach that I would advise. And then once you start, like, I think you should address the core things that were claimed, but not everything that was like mentioned under the sun. And like, oh, PM had all of these things to say, and then LO had all these to say, but then DPM, like, no, just be like, okay, now we're looking. So let's start with the clash on top half. These were the 3 things that were discussed on top half. And then you start with the first clash, and then quickly the contributions, and then why the panel found, or you found some things more persuasive than others, etc. So again, the most important things like clashes and things, not every word or every example or whatever. Oh yeah, and I have an ABC here. Good, great. What clashes you identified, what contribution was provided, and why you find contributions more or less persuasive. I didn't even look at that. Cool. And then thirdly, then to like obviously just cover all the relations based on these very simple principles, right? On what clashes you identified, what contribution was provided, and why did you find the contribution to be more or less persuasive than the a priori claim. It's the same thing that you do it for top half, for benches, for diagonals, for bottom half, just the same sort of formula over and over again. I think it just gets easier the more you sort of practice, because it is sort of like a speech, but unfortunately it's like a 15-minute speech. So you just have, you get better with practice, but it's very important to remember not to overcomplicate it, and to just sort of make sure that you follow the ABCs of this. And I think you should probably always cover the most important things and not miss anything out. Make yourselves give reasons, almost like in a speech is what I would say that would probably make a persuasive or a good OA. And then obviously don't be interventionist in terms of like providing personal rebuttal to claims or like feedback once you're giving the OA, because that, I mean, teams are not going to find useful at that point, and they might just think that you're like that you did not evaluate the content well, that you were sort of looking at it through your own lens. So if you have any feedback, if there are ways that you think should have been done better, save it for personal feedback. Don't put it in the OA. Obviously, then remind teams they can approach you for said feedback, and then lastly, when providing feedback, just make sure, like, again, not to overcomplicate. So when someone asks you, hey, can I get personal feedback or whatever, there's no reason to just like, you know, give them like 10 things that I should probably fix, because like it was like round 2, like they're not gonna, you know, improve 5 speaks between round 2 and round 3. What you should always do is to find the thing that we thought was the thing that they can easily fix, like from round 2 or 3, or something that you can just see was like very, very problematic, thing needs to be addressed like immediately within their content structure, whatever. But like you don't have to like, you know, give them 10 points of feedback and completely address everything that happened in their speech. Is probably not going to be necessarily useful, but just sort of some things they can quickly change, or give them some good piece of advice that helped you. And I think that's what makes probably good feedback that people can easily ask for, easily be given, and easily take in, as opposed to, you know, Bibles of confusing content that someone's going to read a week later. So yeah, that was it. That was right. Cool. Here I also have like links. I'm going to send this, or it's going to be posted underneath the video, I think, of the WEDC judge manual, but I think you can also find it, just you can Google it as well. And then where to find me. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can text me on Messenger. But yeah, that's it for me. I hope you guys find it useful. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So thank you for the workshop. It was very useful. And I have a question on weighing closing against opening. So you mentioned the situation where it was no weighing from closing at all, and the result is quite understandable. Yeah, but when weighing was, should we credit the metric mentioned by whip speaker, for example, absolutely, or should we filter it up? So what filters do we have in such kind of situations?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I don't think that there's ever, unfortunately, like a specific formula I can give you. So like, hey, here are 5 things that you should take into account. I think, obviously, if a whip gives like one reason or like one metric that is like good, and it's why the overall case of closing probably beats opening. It's never taken at face value, right? So you do assess the weighing in the same way that you would assess any positive contribution, is what I was trying to say, right? So although they do have weighing, and that weighing might be true or it might be of a certain quality, it's in the same way when you're evaluating rebuttal, right? So OO might have good rebuttal, but we're not going to take the rebuttal of OO at face value of beating opening government until we genuinely look at everything that happened on the top half. And I think that works for benches as well. So if weighing was done, if it was like mentioned, or someone gave like a few reasons why, write them down and see how they fit in the same way that rebuttal would, because it is like a point of weighing between two benches where, I mean, the judge is the meta debating interventionist figure where it is on you to assess everything that happened and then obviously credit what teams did. But yeah, shouldn't be taken as face value, just, evaluated based on the same metrics of persuasiveness that every sort of positive claim should be, in a way that it should be. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, and one more question on that. Can closing extend only by means of explicit responses on other bench and not having their unique constructive material at all?
Yes, that can definitely happen. I mean, yeah, but rebuttal is sort of, in this instance, then a positive claim, right? So let's say, we have a member who doesn't necessarily say, okay, here's my extension and argument, but they go bit by bit in opening opposition and give a few reasons as to why every single link in OO is not true. Looking at that content in of itself, that is positive material because it brought something, it added on something on that bench, or in terms of engagement with opening opposition. And then the whip, because we would say, but usually the whip's rebuttal. But what whip can do is to weigh specifically then every sort of point of rebuttal as to how it impacted, the other teams, why it was more important than opening or whatever. So rebuttal, or giving reasons why something is not true, is still an extension, in the same way that an extension that here are new reasons why something is true would still be an extension, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. And very last question for me, because I have faced such kind of situation quite. So, for example, opening team has no obvious gaps, and even if it has some gaps, it wasn't challenged by other teams, and closing provides the same idea, but it provides better detailization. So it hasn't filled gaps well, because opening team didn't have some gaps at all on important links, I mean, but the analysis from closing team was really more compelling, but this idea have been already proven and understandable on opening. So I have found three approaches to that. So firstly is to say closing that they have no extension at all, because this idea was well proven and understandable from opening team. Secondly, created their detailization, but they should be they should get, saying that they should get lower rank because this idea was understandable from what opening said, and opening should be higher than closing. And thirdly, give them higher rank compared to opening because they have so many details and it was so compelling. And yes, the idea of opening was understandable enough. It didn't have some explicit gaps, but the analysis of closing was more compelling. For example, what an approach you advise to have?
Look, I think you identified all the approaches really well. And unfortunately, I think it is context dependent. So it is a nuance. Like, someone can just make the same argument much, much, much better. But I think at the point where you said it's like reasonably well proven, or like it's like an 80-ish in OG and it's like 82, 83 in CG, I think that probably then not the most relevant part of their extension. And then we should obviously then focus on like other things, or the more different arguments or more different rebuttals, etc., and see how it all fits. Unfortunately, it's context dependent, right? So someone can add new accessories to an argument and make it sound better. But if what you say is true, which is OG has done it reasonably well enough, then personally, if I have to give an answer, I would say it's not an extension in this instance. But like, it wouldn't take over opening in that instance, I think. But just like, it is context dependent, unfortunately. because maybe there were like other things that were also relevant, but not as cute as the new accessory to emojis argument that could be an extension. So you know what I mean. It's difficult to answer these questions without a proper like example, like that we were in the same round, you know. But I think that the approach which says that it's not an extension would be maybe the correct one, but that's just my take.
Thanks.
Yeah, please. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. It did definitely clear some things for me and fill in some gaps. As for the question, I do have a big problem with grading POIs. Like for me, it's very confusing to who should I give a point. Especially, for example, that most of the times, maybe it's only with me, but then most of the times in rooms or debates that I've judged, POIs are asking for a reason. So they're kind of helping the speaker to give a stronger argument. So I'm like, okay, to whom should I give the point?
Yeah, no, that's actually a good observation. Yeah, so so how do I have myself track POIs is that, and also, you know, if speakers, like, let's say, speak very fast or whatever, the most important thing for me, what I would advise is to just write it down. So whatever the POI was mid-speech, like whatever, you just write POI and then write the POI that was given, and then you can sort of assess it later or see where it fit. Even if a POI, so yeah, that's more like a team's problem, like, but because let's say a POI was some sort of like a rebuttal, right? Or it was like something. And then look, if what you say is true, if someone responded in a way in which it made their own case stronger, good. That means that was a good response to a POI. If a rebuttal or a question was given and the response was like, my partner is going to address this, or like a response that you would also think is just like not a good response to a rebuttal, you just sort of evaluate it as like a line or rebuttal and then see where it fits. But that's why it's important to write it down. But in instances in which you think that what happened was someone took a POI and they gave a good response in a way that made their case better, I think that means that was like a good response to a POI, and therefore you should credit the person that responded well to the POI, but should not penalize the person that gave a bad POI, right? So that would be my take on it. I hope it makes sense.
Okay, so you don't penalize the person that gave the bad POI, and
No.
You give credit for the person that gave a good answer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
No problem. Cool. Does anyone else have any questions left? Cool. If not, I think in that case we are done. If anything does cross your mind in terms of questions, you can find me on Messenger or Discord. It's completely fine.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot. That was very helpful. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.